Today we're going to learn Masechet Eruvin Daf Tet. Today's shiur is sponsored by Yael Asher in memory of her father Elchanan Yosifuf ben Yeshua Zichrono Livracha on his Yurtzeit. We finished yesterday. We were discussing if we had a mavoy. Generally, the beam has to go on the walls of the alleyway. What if you had a peg, and on those pegs, you put some pegs on the outside of the alley, and on those pegs, you hung the beam? Would that work? So Rava said it doesn't work at all because remember, the beam, according to him, has to be lying on the walls of the alley. But Rav Chisda had said it depends. It all depended on this machloket that we discussed before, which is if you view the beam as a mechitza, as if it's an imaginary wall that drops down, then it's going to depend on the person who is more stringent is going to be more lenient here, and the person who is more lenient there will be more stringent here. Remember what that was all about? Because if you view the inner wall drops down and the inner part of the beam drops down, right? There's a whole issue. If we're going to say it creates a wall, there's a thickness of a tefach in that beam. So the question becomes, which part, where does the wall fall from? Does it fall from the outer edge of it or the inner edge? If you say it falls from the outer edge, then you're going to be more lenient when it comes to a regular beam, because you're going to say that all the space underneath, between the beam and that's underneath the beam in the mavoy, in the alley, is going to be permitted because the wall goes on the outside. If it goes from the inside, then we're going to say that it only works for you to carry up until where the beam is. Once you get to the beam, the space under the beam, the imaginary wall drops here, then that space is not going to be allowed. So whatever you hold there, comes from Chisda to say, it will be the opposite in the beam that's hanging outside the mavoy. Because if you say if the beam hangs outside the alley, and you say it falls from the outer part, where we were more lenient in the other case, we're now going to be more stringent because your wall is far away from the alley wall. That's not going to work as a beam. But if you say from the inner side, that's right up against the wall, and therefore it will be allowed. So he basically says it's switched, but Rava says nobody actually thinks that this can work. So now we're going to have a question on Rava, but really it's a bit of a question on Rav Chisda also, but it probably was just that Rav Ada Bar Matna, who asked the question, was in front of Rava, so he asked the question on Rava. So we're starting now from the bottom of Chet Amud Bet, the last few words. Etivei Rav Ada Bar Matna leRava. Etivei, the word Etivei means, it's one of those words that basically explains to you what's going to be, which means we know that we're going to have a Tanaitic source questioning an Amora. So we questioned Rava with the following Tanaitic source. Haita korato mishucha otluya. If the beam was mishucha, it was drawn out. Okay, we're going to assume, what does drawn out mean? Outside the alley, which is going to create our problem here, because now we're going to have a case that's just like it, and yet we're going to see it's different, the halacha. If it's drawn out, or tluya, or it's hanging. So what do we assume this means? Okay, look at your pictures. Okay, hanging would be number 58 in the pictures. We have a beam in the middle standing up, or a post, that on that is hanging a beam, a cross beam, and it doesn't, you can't really see from the video here, but it doesn't reach to the sides of the walls of the mavoy. That means it's hanging. That's literally hanging. It's not attached to anything on the alley walls. It's attached to the floor in between this, right? It's in the space of the alley, right at the edge, but it's not attached on either side. So if it's either mishucha, which we assume means outside the mavoy, or tluya, or hanging, it all depends, according to the source, on how far away, and this goes back to laws of lavud that we've discussed before. Pachot mishlosha ein tzarich lahavi kora acheret. If it's less than 3 away from the wall, either outside the mavoy wall or inside, and we're just saying it's not yet attached to the walls, it's kind of hanging there and suspended, then tzarich lavi kora acheret. I skipped. Pachot mishlosha ein tzarich lavi kora acheret. If it's less than 3, then laws of lavud apply, and we basically say, oh, no problem, right? We view this as if it's attached to the wall. This is always how lavud works. The whole logic of lavud. We view it as if it's attached. Rashba Gomer, pachot, and then if it's, I skipped. Shlosha, if it's 3 or more, Tzarich lavi kora acheret. Then you need to bring a new beam, meaning this doesn't work. Rashbag omer, pachot me'arba'a ein tzarich lavi kora acheret. Arba'a tzarich lavi kora acheret. This is interesting. We always say lavud is 3 tvachim. Now we're going to learn that there's actually a machloket about it. And Rashbag holds, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel held, that 4 is lavud. Okay, it's anything less than 4 tvachim, 4 handbreadths, would we view it as if it's attached. So this machloket is not really significant for our purposes right now, but for our question. But the point is, there happens to be a machloket. Is it 3 or 4? Either which way, both these opinions hold that with lavud it works, which means that if it's outside, if we understand, okay, let's read on one more second. My lav is not mishuchami b'chutz u'tluyami b'fnim, is not the difference between mishucha, drawn out, and tluya, hanging. That hanging is within the airspace of the mavoi. But mishucha is outside the mavoi. And what do you see here? Either opinion holds that as long as it's within 3 or 4 tvachim, we view it as if it's attached to the wall. Now, Rava didn't say anything of the sort. He said if it's hanging on these pegs, it doesn't work because it has to be hanging on top of the walls of the mavoi. So therefore, how does Rava explain this? And even Rav Chisda said, according to one of the opinions, it wouldn't work, right? The Divrei HaMatir Osir here. So he would also have a question. So what does the Gemara answer? We're going to have 2 different explanations of what mishucha otluya means, which basically both explanations are going to say it doesn't mean what we thought it meant. Mishucha does not mean it's outside, in which case this has absolutely nothing to do with Rava or Rav Chisda. So now what do they say? So the first answer is, lo, no, in fact, not. That's not the way we explain it. Idi v'idi mibifnim, both are inside. In this case, the Braita has nothing to do with outside the mavoi, and then this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. What is the difference between mishucha and tluya? What's drawn out and what's suspended? Mishucha miruach achat utluya mishtei ruchot. Okay, the picture I showed you before was where there's a post in the middle. Hanging on that is this beam. It doesn't reach to either wall. That's tluya. That's going to stay the same. Mishucha means it's drawn to one side, meaning it's attached on one side. In general, we've talked about this beam being attached on both sides. So mishucha means it's attached on one side and it's not attached on the other. And then again, the question will be, how far away is it from one of the walls, or how far is the tluya case away from both walls? Now you might say, well, why do you need both cases then? So what do they say? Ma'u detema, you might have thought, miruach achad amrin on lavud, mishtei ruchot lo amrin on lavud, kam mashmalan. You might have thought if we just had mishucha, you might have thought, well, lavud works to connect it to one side, but maybe lavud wouldn't work if it's suspended in the middle and doesn't reach either wall. So the second case is brought. In other words, you really didn't need to bring the first case if that's the case, but the Gemara doesn't address that. But we basically say, not only if it's not attached to one wall, but even if it's not attached to both walls, we still use laws of lavud. So as long as the beam is close enough to the wall that we can say lavud, again, less than 3 or less than 4, depending on who you are and what you hold. But that's what it's teaching us, and it has absolutely nothing to do with a case where it's outside the mavul. A different explanation. Rav Ashi Amar mishucha v'hi tzluya. It says mishucha o tzluya. It doesn't mean either or. It should be read as mishucha v'tzluya. It's drawn and hanging. Okay, what does this mean? So the Gemara doesn't even know. They say, hey chidami, so what's the case? כגון שנעץ שתי יתדות עקומות על שני כותלי מבוי, שאין בגובהן 3 ואין בעקמימותן 3. What's the case here? It's on the mavoi walls. It's not outside, but it's both drawn and hanging. So what does this mean? It means, okay, now there's 2 different pictures here. There's one that you see here, okay, in picture number 60, where it's angled. You have these 2 pegs coming out from the walls of the mavoi, going up and in, basically on an angle. So they're both higher and further in. And then the beam is going to basically not go across the entire length, because it's now going to be, the beam is going to sit on those pegs. So either they're diagonals, or some people say they actually are like the shape of an L. They go up and they go in, and then hanging on that is the beam. Either which way, the beam is still in the same place. It's just a matter of, are they diagonals, or are they like these little posts that are L-shaped, upside down L-shaped? And then that's the case. Okay, now, what did they say here? Ein bigov han shlosha, you would have to be less than 3 height in the pegs, and less than 3 tvachim going in, or less than 4 for Rashbag. And then what's the chidush? So now you understand, mishucha and tluya means both higher up and further in than the walls of the mavoi. And the chidush is ma'u detema, o levud amrinan, o chavot amrinan. You might have thought that you can either say levud works as going sideways, horizontally. Let's say it doesn't reach, it might work, but it might not also help to lower the height. Okay, you might be able to do only one. Therefore, it comes to teach you levud, right? The levud amrinan, o chavot amrinan. Either you can say levud going horizontally, or maybe levud works vertically, but it wouldn't necessarily work both horizontally and vertically. Here we have to basically drop down and move over to the side in order for this to work. So they come to teach you amrinan. You might have thought levud amrinan, ochvot amrinan, levud v'chut lo amrinan. You might have thought, but you can't combine both together. Kamash malan. This comes to teach you the mishoch and taloi, that actually you can do both. You can do levud in 2 directions. You can both use levud to have it drop down a level and have it, right? Remember, levud is all imaginary. This is actually higher and off the sides, but since it's all within 3 tvachim of distance, or 4 according to Rashbag, we basically can say lower it down and move it out to the side, and that works. We can imagine it, we can virtually basically imagine that this goes all the way to the end. Okay, so that was question on Rava from this Mishucha Tluya case. 2 different ways of understanding what the case is that has absolutely nothing to do with Rava's case of hanging the beam outside the wall. This isn't talking about outside. This is all inside the alley. Tani Rabbi Zakkai Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. We're getting to one of my favorite quotes in the Gemara. Rabbi Zakkai comes and says in front of Rabbi Yochanan, he teaches the following braita. Bein lechayayim v'tachar hakora nidon kikarmelit. Between the lechis and under the beam, right, this space. This is what we were discussing at the end of class yesterday. If you remember, yesterday we said there was a machloket about under the beam. How do we view this? Can you carry under there, or is it considered the public domain? And then we saw that Rav Chisda said everyone agrees that between the lechi is forbidden because the lechi doesn't require any sort of thickness, and therefore we can assume it's very thin, and therefore we're not going to allow it to, right, when it's a tefach already, we can say, okay, that works. And there at least there's a machlok. Rav Chisda says everybody agrees between the lechi is not going to be allowed, between the vertically standing post we won't allow. But here we're going to see it's a subject of debate. So Rabbi Zakkai teaches the following braita that says, between the lechis and under the beam is like a karmelit, meaning the rabbis forbade carrying underneath here. Because again, karmelit means forbidden by the rabbis, by rabbinic law. So that is treated like a karmelit, you can't carry. Amar lei, here's my favorite quote. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Puk tnei levara. Go teach your braita outside the Beit Midrash. We have no place for this braita. It's a mistaken braita. Why do I like this? Because it shows a lot of emotion and passion. And I don't want this in my Beit Midrash. You're wrong, right? You have it wrong. So he basically says, go teach this outside. Amar Abaye. So now the question is, there were 2 parts to what he said. He said under the beam and between the posts. The question is, which part did he disagree about? Did he disagree about the whole thing? And did he think, against what we saw Rav Chisda say yesterday, that between posts you can also carry? Or did he just mean under the beam? So we're going to have a debate between Abaye and Rava about this. Amar Abaye, Mistaber milte de Rabbi Yochanan tachar hakora, ava ben lechayayim asur. He must have meant only under the beam, because Abaye assumes between the posts is definitely going to be forbidden. But Rava Amar, bein l'chayayim nami mutar. Rava says, no. Rabbi Yochanan disagreed with the whole thing. He thought that between the posts you can also carry. Each one is now going to bring a proof, and then we're going to have to say what each one does with the proof of the other. Amar Rava. So we start with Rava. Mina minala. How do I know that between posts is also going to be mutar according to Rabbi Yochanan? Now you have to remember, Rabbi Yochanan was living in Israel. Rav and Abaye are in Eretz Yisrael. They're 4th generation. Rabbi Yochanan was 2nd generation. So they're trying to figure out something that was said 2 generations ago in a different place. So what's the best proof they could bring? From someone who brought the Torah of Israel to Bavel. Ki ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, he was one of the Nechute, the people who were Yordim, who used to come from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel and would bring the Torah from there. He said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Makom she'en bo arba'a al arba'a, mutar lebnei reshut harabim ulebnei reshut yachid lekatef alav. This is something we learned in Masechet Shabbat, that if you have, look at picture number 61, if you have these beams, you have sort of beams, it's okay, a little space that's high from off the ground in Reshut Harabim, okay? If it's less than 4 by 4 wide, then we treat this as what we call a makom p'tur. And if you see in the picture, there's a little guy here with a yellow bag. He's got a white shirt and a yellow bag on his back. He's using, right, he's getting tired from carrying the heavy bag. He uses these to basically put his bag down, right? Sometimes you're coming home from the supermarket, you're carrying very heavy bags, you know, it's hurting your back. You want to put them down for a minute or two, so you put them down. The best place to put them is if you have a ledge, right? If you want to put them on the floor, then you'll have to bend down and pick them up off the floor. The most convenient is to use it as a ledge. Therefore, this is considered part of Reshut Harabim because it's the use of Rabim, but it's called a Makom P'tur because it's on a space of less than 4 by 4. It's for use of people in Reshut Harabim, right? And we allow this on Shabbat because it's called a Makom P'tur, and you're allowed to move from a Makom P'tur. Literally means an exempt space. It means you're allowed to carry. We're going to read it right now inside. Ubilvad shelo yachlifu. Okay, what can you do, right? So it's a makom she'en bo daled al daled mutar lebnei reshut harabim ulebnei reshut yachid. If you're in a private or you're in a public domain, you can move your bag or anything you want onto this space, as long as bilvad shelo yachlifu. You can't say, oh, my house is here, public domain is there, and in between I have a makom p'tur. I'm going to move it from there. I'm going to say, oh, well, this I can do. And then from there, you can move it to the Reshut Harabim, even though technically speaking, you can move an item from a makom p'tur, from a private to a makom p'tur, and from a makom p'tur to a public, but you can't take one item and move it, you know, have it make that jump, because in the end, you're basically, we don't want to allow you, people will think you can move things from Reshut Yachid to Reshut Harabim, which is obviously not allowed. So now, what does this have to do with it? Well, let's look at our space. Our space in between the lechayim is less than 4 tfachim, by 4 tfachim. So why don't we view this space as a makom p'tur? That's what Rava says. Therefore, it must be, since Rabbi Yochanan said, as we heard from Rav Dimi, that if you have the space that's less than 4 by 4, we view it as a makom p'tur, we can assume this is also a makom p'tur, this open space in the mavoi, which is in the entrance to the mavoi, which is next to the lechi, right? There's a lechi on one side, there's a wall, the mavoi on the other. We're going to view it as a makom p'tur. So comes Abai, what does he say to this? And maybe you thought about this already. Abai, hatam begova shlosha. A makom p'tur has to be an object that has at least a height of 3. In other words, this is just an you're basically saying this imaginary space in between, not imaginary, but it's just space. It doesn't actually have an object. It's not like the case we just saw of there was some height to it, right? It just wasn't 4 by 4 width, but there was height to it. It had some. So if we can't say just this dead space, which doesn't have any height to it, is called a makom p'tur, and therefore he says you can't carry there. Okay, Abai says, don't learn from that statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and that has nothing to do with our case. Amar Abai mina minala. So now we need Abai's proof, though. Okay, so you can't prove it from there that he basically could say, Rava, that's not a good proof, but he has to prove his own. So where do I know that you can't carry between the chayim according to Rabbi Yochanan? So he says, Da'amar Rav Chama bar Guria amarav toch hapetach tzarich lechi acher lahatiro. Okay, what's this case? This is a case. It's picture number 62. Okay, we have now, generally we've been talking about our mavoi, that there's basically walls that just lead out of the alley. But now we're going to have a case where the walls of the mavoi narrow near the exit. So they get narrower. Now, if they get narrower, that means there's basically a wall that looks kind of like a lechi jutting out, right? Now, it's jutting out on the inside of the mavoi and then also outside the mavoi, but when you get to the exit on the mavoi, you don't really see anything, but you do see it from the inside, because if you're in this space, right, or in the space behind, you'll see these lechis jutting out, but it really juts out not as a lechi, it functions more, right, it just makes the exit or the entrance to the mavoi narrower. So this is what we call, he says, tocha petach, if you're within the entranceway to the alley, which is, let's assume it's narrower, okay, if you're in that entrance, sarich lechi acher lahatiro. You need, now, what does this mean? It means that in the mavoi you can carry, because in the wider part of the mavoi, there's a lechi there. because the wall goes in, and that wall going in is what we call nir emi bifnim, right? You can see it from the inside. It's very clearly distinguishable as if this is, right? And then you basically say the mavoi kind of ends there. If you want to carry in the entranceway, which is now narrower, you need a new lechi at the end of that entranceway to allow carrying within the entranceway, okay? That narrower space. So what do you see here? If theoretically we're considering that whole narrow entranceway as a lechi, and you need a lechi lahatir, what does that show? It shows bein l'chayayim is forbidden. So he says from there I can infer that he thinks it's forbidden. Now this, by the way, wasn't quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but we can assume if Rav said it that Rabbi Yochanan agreed. V'chi tema de'it be arba'a al-arba'a. Maybe you'd say that the space has 4 by 4 tfachim, which means once it has 4 by 4, if you remember, or it's actually, it could be 4 amo to 4 tfachim. Remember there was a whole debate that if you had, what's the minimum size of a mavoi? It could be 4 by 4 tfachim or 4 by 4 cubits. So let's say it has 4 by 4, and then maybe this whole space becomes its own mavoi. And that's why it needs a lechi, and not because it's viewed as bein l'chayayim, but if this already has the minimum size for a new mavoi, maybe we would consider this its own mavoi, and that's why it needs its own alley. That's why it needs a heter, and then you won't learn anything from here. He says that can't be though, because Ha'amar Rav Chanim bar Rav Amar Rav, because Rav Chanim bar Rav said in the name of Rav, Toch hapetach, in the entranceway, our case, he said explicitly in the name of Rav, someone else, not the same person who just said it in the first place, someone else said explicitly in the name of Rav, it doesn't matter how big, even if it doesn't have 4 by 4, you would still need a lechi, which again shows bein l'chayayim would be forbidden. So what's Rava going to say? Here he has a very interesting answer. Rava, hatam de patuach lekarmelit. That case where you needed a new lechi is a case, now generally what have we been talking about? An alley that opens to the public domain. We've always said, right? Public domain on this side, if it's mufulach, it's got public domain on both sides. But he says this is when it's open to a karmelit, which is a space that's only forbidden by the rabbis, right? Like a sea or like, any kind of big space that doesn't have all the criteria of Reshut HaRabim, has a lot of people, but not enough people or not enough width or whatever it might be. Now, this comes out very strange. He's going to say that when it opens to Reshut HaRabim, you don't need a lechi. This case was when it opens to the karmelit. And then the bein l'chayayim is going to be forbidden. Whereas if it opens to Reshut HaRabim, we're going to allow the bein l'chayayim. And that seems very strange. And the Gemara is going to say so in a very kind of funny manner. They say, aval Reshut HaRabim, my sharis. You're going to say, if it opens to the public domain, we're going to be more lenient in the space in between the posts. Yitziva ba'ara v'giora b'shmei shmaya. The local gets the ground, and the stranger gets up to the heavens. Okay, where does this come from? It's a pasuk in Dvarim, in the Klalot, in the Tochacha, in the portion that says about all the bad things that are going to happen. One of the things listed there in Parshat Ki Tavo, I think it's in Perek Kafchet, it says, I forgot to bring the exact verse, but it says there, you're going to be, right, the stranger is going to go up to the heavens and you're going to be low in the earth, okay? And it comes from there, and it's basically saying what? We're going to be, and what's it basically saying? We're going to be more stringent with something that's only from the rabbis, and something that's from Torah law, we're going to be more lenient and say you could carry between the lechi here when it opens to Reshut HaRabim. It's counterintuitive, makes no sense. So what do they answer? They take something from the laws of ta'arovot, which is mixtures like forbidden and permitted, or basar b'chalav, milk and meat, okay, and we'll explain in a minute. Yes, you could say it would be the case here. Why? We'll be more machmir on a karmelit. Matzah min et mino v'ne'or. Let's explain what this means. What it means in basar b'chalav is like this. Let's say you have a drop of milk that drops into your chulent, okay, your meat chulent. So what do we say? Batel b'shishim. It's canceled out in 60. What if after that first drop drops in, another drop drops in, and now let's say there was 60 keneged the one against the one drop, but now you have 2 drops. So do we say the first one was already nullified and it's as if it doesn't exist anymore? Or do we say matzah minit mino, the milk meets the milk, it finds its like, right? This is the opposite of opposites attract, right? It finds itself and wakes itself up, right? Wakes up something similar to it. So that's ni'or. Ni'or comes from to wake someone up, right? To wake up, or to wake something up. So what happens here? When it meets the other one, when it basically if the mavoi, which is close to a Carmelite, it's not really close to a Rishut Rabim, it's a little bit close, and that's why we have all this problem that people walk through, but it's much more similar to a Carmelite. So if we say this space in between the Lechi is next to the Carmelite, then the Carmelite meets up with it, and it basically becomes like a Carmelite. It's like saying we can't jump this up 2 levels to say we're going to turn it into a Rishut Rabim D'Oraita, but we can claim it's a Carmelite. So if it opens to a Carmelite, then the Carmelite basically turns it into a Carmelite. When it opens to Rishut Rabim, they're 2 different, and therefore it's going to basically stay in its own independent identity and not lose its identity to the public domain. So that's how Rava answers Abaye's proof. Now we're going to have a question on Rava. Amale Rav Huna bereid Rav Yoshua leRava. So again, Rava was explaining again. This is all. How did they explain what Rabbi Yochanan said? Puktana levara, go teach this outside. What did he mean? Did he agree about? Did he disagree about both, or did he disagree only about the Korah? Right? The Braita had said you can't carry underneath them; they're like a Carmelite. And came Abai and he said he disagrees about both. You can carry under both of them. And Rava said no, you can't carry between the Lechi. So. Sorry, the opposite. Rava said you can carry underneath the Lechi, right? It's my mistake. Rava said you can carry underneath the Lechi, and then we had to explain, right? The only case where he doesn't allow it is if it opens to a Carmelite. That was our whole thing. So now he says, you don't think that Rabbi Yochanan thinks that between the Lechi is forbidden? How do you say it's allowed? Again, when it opens to Rishut HaRabim. Again, we're going to bring a statement. Someone said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mavoi sheritzafo belechayim pachot pachot me'arba'a banu lemachloket Rashbag veRabanan. This is what we call wood paneling. Okay, let's say you have a bunch of panels of wood in kind of lined up at the Mavoi wall, going from near the entrance to almost outside the entrance. We're going to see that ultimately they're going to understand that the last panel is sticking out a little bit of the Mavoi wall. Okay, it's in picture number 63. So you have these 4 wooden, or it doesn't matter how many, but you can't really see in the video, but there's 4 separate ones with a distance in between them. Okay, if you panel your wall, you probably put them right next to each other. Here, they put them with a certain amount of separation, and that's going to obviously be the issue. How separated are they? If they're less than levud, then what are we going to say? We view it as one wall. If they're not levud, then we're going to view them as 4 separate pieces. So what's the significance? So if you have these lechis less than 4 tfachim apart from each other, then we get to the machloket Rashbag veRabanan. How so? Le Rashbag da'amrin on levud. Rashbag says levud, which means what? He views these beams as if they're one. If they're viewed as one, now from where are you allowed to carry? Now we're going to see that everybody's going to say you can only carry up until where the lechi starts. Okay? Chodo hapnimi, basically. So, mishtamesh ad chodo hapnimi shel halechi, which means you're going to be a lechi hapnimi. Since they're all viewed as one long thing, it's one long lechi. So therefore, according to Rashbag, you're only going to be able to carry until the first panel. Once you get to the later panels, you're already between the lechayim and it's forbidden. L'Rabanan da'amre lo amrin on levud, but according to the rabbis, there's no levud because there's almost 4 tfachim in between. Right? You'd have to have up to 3, but this is more than 3 in between each one. So they're each viewed separately. Which one functions as the lechi? The last one, because only the last one is next to the wall of the mavoi. So the outer one, he's going to say, Mishtamesh ad chodo hapnimi shel chitzon. He's going to say, where do you have to carry until? Up until the inner edge of the outer one, which again shows both of them agree that what? Avabein lechayim dekule alma asur. They both say you can only go up to the inner edge of the lechi. It's just a matter of where your inner edge starts. Everyone agrees that once you get to the lechi itself, you can't go any farther. So again, that was said in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which means that Rabbi Yochanan seems to say between the lechayim is forbidden. So Rabbi, how could you say he thinks it's allowed? So what do we say? Again, same answer. Hatam nami de patuach lekarmelit. That's when it's open to a Carmelite. Aval l'reshut harabim. So then the Gemara is going to ask again. L'reshut harabim, my share. So you're going to say if it opens to the public, he would allow this. Yitziva ba'ar b'gior b'shmei shmaya. Right, the local gets to the ground, but the stranger gets all the way up to the heavens. Yes, in fact, it's true. Matzah mini mino v'nei ol. Right, when it's near the Carmelite, it's going to turn it into a Carmelite. And basically, we're going to say that statement was only said in a Carmelite. And then it's not a question. Here we have a second answer to Rava, to the source. Rav Ashi Amar, Kigon sheretzafo b'lechayim pachot mechot me'arba'a. Same thing so far. Less than 4 tefachim of distance, 4 handbreadths of distance between. But b'meshech arba amot. However, the distance from the first one to the last one was 4 cubits. Once it's 4 cubits, this is what we said earlier, it already becomes its own mavoi. So what do we say? L'Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel de'amar amurin on levud havalei mavoi v'tzarich lechi acher latiro. According to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the machloket is not what we said before. Okay, the machloket before we said was, can you do it ad chudah pnimi shela pnimi, right? The innermost lechi until the innermost point of the innermost lechi, or is it the innermost point of the outermost lechi? But now we're going to say the machloket is different according to Rav Ashi. The machloket is about if those 4 beams, again, were distance almost 4 tefachim apart. Rav Shimon Gamliel views this as one long wall. Since it stretches a distance of 4 amot, this is like the case we saw before where the walls went in, right? It's the same idea. Now you have a space that's 4 amot, which is basically the minimum length of a whole mavoi in and of itself. This becomes its own mavoi, and Rashbag says you need a new lechi there, right? This, again, the first lechi that's inside the mavoi can function as a lechi for the inner part of the alleyway. But if you want to carry in this part of the alley, you're going to need a new lechi because this is all considered its own new alley. So he says you would need a new lechi. L'Rabanan da'amre lo amrin an levud. So according to them, you just have a few posts here. They're not all attached to each other because they're distance more than the laws of levud. And therefore, what would he say? What's going to function as your lechi? The outermost one is going to be your lechi because that's standing right at the mavoi wall. The others are just panels on your wall, have no relevance. And therefore, you would say, lo tzarich lechi acher latiro. According to him, you don't need another lechi. That lechi functions. And here, he doesn't say anything about what about the space in between the lechis. So this doesn't necessarily prove, right? It doesn't show that Rava was wrong because he doesn't discuss what the story is between the lechis. Okay? Okay, so therefore, we have a different explanation. This has nothing to do with Bein L'Chayayim. Now we're going to have a question on Ram Shimon ben Gamliel. Ram Shimon ben Gamliel, lehave kinir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim. Why don't we say that, why do you need another lechi? When you have this paneling on the wall, and then this is what I said before, the assumption is that this just juts out a little bit past the end of the mavoi wall. The last panel is a little bit outside. So it's flush against the wall, but it stretches a little bit longer than the mavoi wall. So that would be a case of nir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim, right? When you're, according to Rashbag, this creates its own wall. So it doesn't jut out at all into the mavoi because it becomes the wall of the mavoi is this long stretch of a few beams. But when you're outside, since it juts out, you can actually see it. It's noticeable from the outside. And if you remember, we said that there's a machloket about nir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim. And right now, when they question Rashbag, the way we were trying to understand, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, why don't we say it's nir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim, and therefore it should count as a lechi, and you shouldn't need another lechi to allow carrying in it. So they say, midi utama ela Rabbi Yochanan. Aren't we trying to explain this whole thing was quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? Remember, let's just go back. Rav Huna b'reit Rabbi Yoshua. Rabba Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ravoy sheritzafo b'lechayim pachot me'arba banu lemachloket Rashbag v'Rabbanan. So he says it's all based on this machloket Rashbag v'Rabbanan. Whether you need, and then how did Rav Ashi explain whether you need a lechi to allow this or you don't? So he says, but even in the case where we view it as one wall, still it's noticeable from the outside. Okay, you can see it jutting out in picture number 64. Okay, I'm not going to show it on the screen because it's hard to see from the screen, but you can see that the fourth one juts out if you have the pictures in front of you. So basically, he says, we're trying to explain Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan, okay, so now, aren't we talking according to Rabbi Yochanan? The haki ata Ravin, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, when Ravin came and brought, he was another one of those Nechuti who came from Israel to Babylonia. He said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, nir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim eino nido mishum lechi. And that's why, according to Rashbag, Rabbi Yochanan thinks Rashbag will require a new lechi because seeing it from the outside doesn't allow this to be called a lechi. Remember, you have to see it from the inside. Right? What's the machloket about this? Who's the lechi for? Is the lechi for the people in the mavoi, which is generally what we thought it was for, right? Because it's to tell you, here's the border, don't cross here. You're heading into Reshut HaRabim. But some people think, no, the lechi is for Reshut HaRabim. Why would it be? I didn't discuss this yesterday. Why would you think the lechi would be a noticeable marker for the people in the public domain? Because you might think if people in the public domain see people carrying in the alleyway, they'll think, if they could carry, that's kind of a public space, and this is a public space, they won't really notice the difference. And they'll think that they can carry in the public domain also. And therefore, there needs to be some noticeable demarcation for them that we're entering into an alley here, and those people are in a different space than you are. So therefore, Niremi Bachutz would be valid if we say that that's the important part of the mavur. So anyway, you can't suggest, like they tried to suggest, that maybe we need another lechi according to Rashbag because it juts out, because the jutting out is only, for Rabbi Yochanan's purposes, it doesn't really matter if it juts out into the public. It's a matter of the perspective of the people in the mavoi. And for the perspective of the people in the mavoi, this is just a wall. It's just a thicker part of the wall of the mavoi. And because it goes 4 amot, it's really a significant wall, and you would need another lechi to allow it, to allow carrying in that space. But again, this has nothing to do with, right, we're back to our original, this has nothing to do with, is the space between lechis allowed or not? Okay, since we've quoted now this issue of Niremi Bachutz v'Shavemi Bifnim, we're going to see the machloket about it, and we're going to try to see who's the one who holds that it's allowed or not allowed. Itmar. So Itmar is always an intro to a machloket between two Amoraim. Niremi Bifnim v'Shavemi Bachutz nidon mishum lechi. Niremi Bachutz v'Shavemi. Actually, here it's a machloket Tanaim. Niremi Bachutz v'Shavemi Bifnim. Okay, so everyone agrees that if you see it from the inside, even if it's flush on the outside, and on the outside it's not noticeable at all, that would be a lechi, because everyone agrees that for the b'nei mavoi, if it's noticeable to the b'nei mavoi, that's fine. The question becomes, near emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim, Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Shimon b'Rebbe, the two of them debate this issue. Chad amar nidon mishum lechi, v'chad amar eino nidon mishum lechi. This is a case where we have two opinions. We don't know who says what. One says it works. One says it doesn't work. Again, this is where you only see it from the outside. So now they say, Tistayim de Rabbi Chia huda amar nidon mishum lechi. It seems like Rabbi Chia must be the one who says this functions as a lechi, even though it can only be seen from the outside. Why? Titani Rabbi Chia, because he brought the following braita. Kotel shetzido echad kanus mechavero. Okay, again, we're going to look at two pictures now. Picture number 68 and picture number 67. Okay, picture number 67 depicts a wall that's on the outer wall of the mavoi. Already juts out to the left, right? You're outside the mavoi on the wall that is flush with Reshut HaRabim. There's an indentation in the wall, okay? So when you're in your mavoi, it's kind of in. But when you go out into the Reshut HaRabim, it juts out somewhere in Reshut HaRabim. So that is going to be called, you can notice it from the outside. You can see that there's a distinction in the wall here, but you can't see it from the inside. Another case is going to be where near emi b'fnim v'shavemi b'chutz. Here's a case in 68 where there's an indentation in the wall of the mavoi itself. So here you're going to be able to see it from the inside, but it goes in and then back out. So basically in the mavoi, you're going to see a distinction there. But when you're in the outside, you're not going to see anything. Okay? So according to Rabbi Chia's braita, if one part went in, whether it's noticeable from the outside and not the inside, or whether it's noticeable from the inside and not the outside, nidon mishum lechi. This functions as a lechi. Who brought that braita? Well, who brought the braita was Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia brought this braita. What do you see? He holds, if it's noticeable from the outside and not the inside, it works. So there you have it. He must be the one who holds that. So now they have an interesting possible question on this, and they kind of answer with the obvious answer. Rabbi Yochanan, mi lo shmi alei? Wait, could it possibly be that this braita that Rabbi Chia brought, Rabbi Yochanan didn't know about this braita? Obviously, he must have known about this braita. And if he knew about this braita, it didn't hold this way, because remember, we said he doesn't hold this way. Ha ela shmi alei. Ha lo shmi alei ha. What, he didn't hear this braita? Ela shmi alei v'lo sarala. he must have heard about the Braita and just didn't hold that way. If we assume that Rabbi Yochanan heard about the Braita, didn't hold that way, can't we say the same about Rabbi Chia? Rabbi Chia nami, lo savar lahai, lo savar lah. Maybe he didn't hold like the Braita, Rabbi Chia. Possible, right? Just because he brought the Braita doesn't mean he held like it. So they say, what are you talking about? Hi, my, what are you talking about? Bishlama Rabbi Yochanan lo savar lah, mishum hachi lo tanei lah. Rabbi Yochanan, if he didn't hold like the Braita, it makes a lot of sense because he didn't hold like the Braita, and that's why we don't see Rabbi Yochanan quoting that Braita because he didn't hold like it. But Ella Rabbi Chia, if he didn't hold that way, then why would he have brought the Braita in the first place? And people don't quote Braitot, some for the sake of quoting Braitot they don't agree with. The fact that Rabbi Chia quoted this Braita must prove that he held like the Braita. So even though we can assume that Rabbi Yochanan must have also heard about that Braita, the fact that he doesn't quote it proves he doesn't hold that way. Here, he didn't quote it. But Rabbi Chia, who did quote it, must be the one who holds that way, and therefore you can say that Rabbi Chia was the one. This was all to question. Maybe Rabbi Chia is not the one who says that it's Nidom Mishum Lechi. He says, no, it does work, okay? The Niremi Bachutz does work according to Rabbi Chia, and therefore we're okay. So, moving on. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Niremi Bachutz v'shavemi b'fnim Nidom Mishum Lechi. Okay, so now we have it in the name of Rabba bar Rav Huna, that if you can see it from the outside, it works as a lechi, just like we just said, Rabbi Chia said. So I'm a Rabba. Now Rabba is going to question Rabba bar Rav Huna. Umotvina nashmatim. Why don't we question this from our case that we saw yesterday of the courtyard? Remember the small courtyard that opens up into a bigger courtyard? So now that's a good case of, what did we say? The bigger courtyard can carry because it has these gifufim, has some walls on the barrier between it and the narrower one. You can see the walls. But when you're inside the chatzer, the smaller courtyard, you don't see any walls. It just juts out into this big chatzer. You can't carry, even in your own chatzer. So now, we would say, chatzer ktana shenifratzah gdola, gdola muteret, uktana asura. The big courtyard people are allowed to carry within their courtyard because there's a distinction. But the small courtyard, you can't see anything. So, mipnei shu kipitcha shel gdola, right? Because it opens right into the big one. Vim ita, and if near emi bachutz would work, we should be allowed to carry in the small courtyard because you can notice it from the outside, right? The barrier between the big one and the small one is very clear if you're standing in the outside in the big one. So therefore, again, look at picture, now they have the picture here. Look at picture number 69, right? Yesterday we had to look further on. Picture number 69, in your smaller courtyard, there's a lechis kind of on the side as it stretches out to, and that's something you can see from the outside, not from the inside. So Rabba says to Rabba bar Rav Huna, if you think this works, why doesn't it work to carry in the Chatzer Ktana? So now what we're going to have to do is this is what we call an ukimta. We're going to say that Mishnah is talking about a particular case, not exactly the way we understood it to begin with. Amar Rabbi Zera, b'nichnesim kotlei ktana l'gedola. It's when, and look at picture number 70 now, the walls of the Chatzer Ktana, before we thought it was flush against the walls of the Chatzer Gdola. Now we're going to see the walls jut out farther. So now when they jut out farther, the lechi is no longer near the entrance. The lechi of the border near to the Chatzer Gdola is not recognizable when you're standing at the edge of the wall of the Chatzer Ktana, because those walls jut out farther. And because they jut out farther, you're basically not going to be able to see any lechi mi bachutz. It's no longer near emi bachutz. So they had to basically come up with a case that it's not near emi bachutz in order to explain Rabba bar Rav Huna's position that near emi mi bachutz is okay. So we have to say this isn't near emi bachutz, otherwise it would work and you'd be able to carry in the Chatzer Ktana. So to which the Gemara asks, v'lema levud v'tishtare. But why don't you say the din of levud applies here? Now, if you notice that picture, the way it was drawn is that the Chatzer Ktana is very wide. The Chatzer Gdola is just a little bit wider than it. So if those walls jut out farther, we can assume, and we'll see in a minute why we assume this, that it's less than 3 tvachim from the wall of the bigger one, which means that we can assume din of levud as if these walls on the side that are jutting out kind of really attach themselves to the other walls, in which case you can see the lechi. Because in the imaginary world, levud means that less than 3 tvachim, it's as if it's over there, which means it's as if it's not right here jutting out and it's not blocking our view of the lechi from the outside. So therefore, the lechi should work. And v'chitem, and if you want to say demifligate tuva, that it from din levud, there is no din levud because it's more than 3 tvachim away, can't be, because hatani Ravada bar Avimi kamei Rabbi Chanina, he taught a braita about that Mishnah. It's very common that there were braitot about Mishnayot explaining them. Ktana be'eser, gdola be'echatasrei. The case is, and that's why it's drawn like this, that the ktana is 10 amot wide. Why is it 10 amot? Because that's a petach. Remember, any more than that, it would be bigger, right? Then it wouldn't be a petach. So it's 10 amot wide. The bigger one is 11. Now do the calculation. How much space is in between the entrance to the small one and the wall of the bigger one? Well, it's from 10 to 11. It's one whole amma. Part of that amma, now an amma is 6 tfachim, remember our whole discussion. So you could say 3 and 3, but it's not, because there's the thickness of the small wall. So the wall of the small courtyard has a thickness there. That takes up part of the one amma. You're now left with less than 3 on this side, less than 3 on that side, din levud. So basically, we're going to assume din levud, in which case we're back to square one. It should be near emi bifnim. Near emi bachutz. Okay, and it should be allowed. So now they answer, well, you could have 2 answers. Amar Ravina, b'muflagim mikotel ze b'shnayim and mikotel ze b'arba'a. Maybe it's not even, a little less than 3 on either side, but less than 2 on one side, less than, more than, 4 on, it's basically a little less than 2 and a little less than 4 on the other side, which means that there's no levud on one of the sides. Now, you might say, what do we care? It's not on both sides. What do you generally need? A lechi on one side. So theoretically, if you have it less than 2 tvachim on one side, you should say levud. You basically count that little piece that connects the two, right, where the bigger one juts out. It should be viewed as your lechi. So why wouldn't you say that? We'll just continue to drop into the next page. Rebihi da'amar b'inan shnei pasim. You'd have to say that the Mishnah goes like Rebbe, who holds that to let a courtyard, now there's a difference between a courtyard and a mavoi. In alleyway, you need only 1 lechi. But in a courtyard, we're going to be more stringent. We'll see why in a minute. And you're going to need 2 pasim. You're going to need 1 on either side. And in this case, if it's 2 and 4, you're not going to have it on the 4 side because, right, the wall juts out. Remember, our whole ukimta was the wall juts out and you can't see it from the outside. Only on one side, you'll have din levud, where we then theoretically can view it in an imaginary way. And how do we know that Rebbe holds this? Tanya chatzer niteret b'pasachad, according to Tanakama, Rebbe omer b'shnei pasim. Why is it different in alley and a chatzer? So there's 2 possible reasons given. One is a chatzer generally requires more privacy than a mavoi because it's more private space. So therefore, you need 2 to allow carrying in it. The other answer is that if you remember our mavoi, and here you really see it clearly in the picture, is very narrow, right? It's narrower more than it's long, right? We already said it has to be more narrow, and it's a kind of a long rectangle, but narrow. If something's narrow, then 1 lechi is enough because you can view it kind of from anywhere. If it's wide, like this is wide and short, therefore you're going to need, if you're standing on one side, you're not going to see from the other side because of the shape of it, and therefore you're going to need 2 in a chatzer, because a chatzer doesn't necessarily have to be longer than it is wider. And that's another possible reason for the distinction. Okay, we'll end here for today and pick up from here tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.